Okay, I could go on about Grant forever, but let me give you a brief biography. Grant was born in Ohio. Some of the best Union generals actually were from Ohio. One of the ways to think about Ohio, it was the Virginia of the Union. If Virginia was the essential state for the Confederacy, you can argue that Ohio was the essential state for the Union. Ohio was always very, very pro-Union, even when the war got tough. And as I just said, some of the best generals, Grant, William Sherman, William Sheridan, Phil Sheridan rather, came from Ohio. He was born to a merchant, a guy that Grant didn't like very much. He didn't like his father very much. But he was from a middling kind of family. They weren't rich. They certainly weren't poor, and they had enough connections. His father did to gain Grant admission into West Point because to get into West Point you have to have a recommendation from either someone in the House of Representatives or a U.S. Senator. Now his name was Hiram Ulysses Grant. But through some kind of mess up, when he went to West Point messed up, and they thought his name was Ulysses Samuel Grant. And that became his name because the Army bureaucracy was so cumbersome, as I think it probably still is. It was easier for Grant just to say, well, screw it, I'll just take this new name. So Hiram Ulysses Grant became Ulysses Samuel Grant. And it's interesting. You wonder about fate at this point because he becomes U.S. Grant, and U.S. Grant becomes, United States, right? He's the guy that saves the United States. And he also becomes famous as Unconditional Surrender Grant because when he defeated Confederate armies during the Civil War and they would ask for terms, he would always just say unconditional surrender. So anyway, it's just kind of an interesting thing about how Hiram Ulysses became Ulysses Samuel Grant and how that ties into his success during the Civil War. At West Point, he ranked 21st out of a class of 39. He became friends with a number of Southern West Point cadets. They were all in there together. Grant he was good at math. He hated West Point actually. He kept on hoping he would drop out or he'd get kicked out, but he never did. He was known for being a horseman. Grant was extremely skilled at riding horses. He just had a knack for horsemanship, for calming down horses. He marries his roommate's sister, a woman by the name of Julia B. Grant, and they have a very, very happy marriage. After the war, Grant serves in Mexico during the U.S. invasion of Mexico, beginning in 1846. And Grant really opposed the Mexican-American War. In his memoirs, which he wrote in the 1880s, he was dying and he was broke in the 1880s, and he wrote his memoirs and they were a great success. They made his family a lot of money, and by the way, they're extremely readable. They're beautifully written. Probably the best presidential memoirs written. Grant talks about the Mexican experience, and he says that he thought that the war with Mexico was the most unjust war ever waged by a stronger power against a weaker power. He knew that the Mexican War was just a land grab on behalf of Democrats to extend slavery. Nonetheless, though, he did his duty. He served with great distinction in the Mexican-American War. At one point, in one of the battles, there were a group of Mexican soldiers shooting at some U.S. soldiers, and Grant kind of dragged an artillery, a cannon, up to the top of a steeple and started firing on the Mexican troops and dispersed them. And he gained some attention for this, very, very brave and very, very cool activity in the midst of battle. I think the important thing about Grant in Mexico is he realized that he could keep a cool head during battle. Most people can't. I don't think I could. Can you imagine, and maybe some of you guys out there are veterans and have been in battle, it's a very chaotic and a very dangerous situation, but Grant's one of those rare individuals that not only does he not lose his head during battle, he can look around at the landscape around him, and he could make some sense out of what it was going on, the ebb and flow of battle, which makes him even rarer, and it made him a very successful general. The other thing that happened with Grant during the Mexican-American War, he served as a quartermaster. He did the kind of basic nuts and bolts duties that's required of a quartermaster, making sure men get fed, making sure that they get letters, making sure that the camp is clean. And he kind of learned in Mexico, he kind of learned how an army works. Now, he's not the only one. A number of Union and Confederate soldiers got what you might consider their master's or even their PhD as military officers while serving in the Mexican-American War. Robert E. Lee was one, McClellan was one, Stonewall Jackson was one. Grant's certainly not the only U.S. officer that gained valuable skills in the Mexican War. But, you know, he took them to heart, and it's one of the things that makes him quite successful as a Union general. So after the war, he has a tough time. He has a very successful war. He gains some small renown. During the 1850s, there's only about 50 or so captains in the U.S. Army, and Grant's one of them. So he was doing pretty well in the U.S. Army. But he was stationed on the West Coast, especially in the Northwest, Vancouver. He was away from his wife. The weather was really gloomy. He started drinking. And long story short, he resigns from the Army under a little bit of a cloud. And he leaves the Army with the reputation as a drinker. And one of the things you need to remember about the U.S. Army at this point, it was a very, very small world. Everybody knew everybody else. You know, the West Point class that Grant was in was only 40-something. So it's a very, very small world, and what makes this very poignant, as you'll see at the Battle of Gettysburg, is that a lot of the officers that fought against one another in the Civil War had been very close friends before the Civil War. So Grant comes back home. He moves to Illinois, actually, and he has a very tough time in the 1850s. He can't make anything. He can't make a go of anything. He tries to be a merchant. It doesn't work out. He does own a slave, but much to his credit, to his great credit, even at a point where slaves was worth today $50,000. Grant released that slave. He gave the slave his freedom. He wasn't an abolitionist, I would say, but he just couldn't stand the thought of owning another human being. So when the Civil War breaks out, Grant is 39 years old. He is basically a failure. He'd had 10 years of just struggle, a little bit less in the 1850s. And he's forced to go work in his father's store. His father owned a tannery, and Grant hated working in a tannery. He hated the slaughter of animals. He hated working for his father, who he didn't have much respect for. And it's just, you know, so when the Civil War starts, Grant is just really at loose ends, and things are not going well. But then the Civil War starts. It breaks out in April of 1861. And suddenly now, Grant's fortunes take one of the most dramatic turns of the fortunes of any individual in U.S. history. And the reason for that is that U.S. Grant was an experienced Army officer at a point in history where the United States needed experienced Army officers. Grant had fought well in Mexico. Grant knew how to fill out the bureaucratic Army forms that it takes to order commissary goods. Grant knew the code of the U.S. Army. So he suddenly now he becomes a very, very valuable commodity. And he talks about he's appointed an officer in the Union Army, and he moves up the ranks very, very quickly. And there's this amazing line in his memoirs that right after the Civil War, there was great enthusiasm for joining the Union Army in states of the North, such as Illinois. And Grant went and he offered his help. And he said that he would aid the company, the military company being raised in every way I could, and that he would be found in the Army if there should be a war. And then there's this amazing line that Grant uses in his memoir. He says, and this is a quote, "I never went into our leather store after that meeting to put up a package or do any other business." So what you get in that line is Grant in a very low-key way, which is really Grant's style. He's not bombastic. He's kind of Grant's the anti-McClellan in all kinds of ways. Hopefully you've watched the Antietam documentary. If Grant had picked up those cigars that had Lee's orders, believe me, he wouldn't have messed around. But again, let me read that line. "I never went into our leather store," talking about his dad's leather store, after that meeting, the meeting to organize a military company, to put up a package or do any other business. When the Civil War broke out, Grant's life changed completely, so much so that this kind of anonymous clerk working in his father's store, almost 40, things aren't going well, suddenly becomes a figure that I'm talking about on February 25th, 2016. He becomes immortal.